She was supposed to be a billionaire's wife, but she vanished into the streets. Helena Lawson walked away from wealth, power, and an arranged marriage to escape a life she never wanted. Ethan Carter, a ruthless billionaire, found her at her lowest, but she wasn't who he thought she was. Lies, betrayal, and a past that refused to stay buried pulled them into a dangerous game where love wasn't just a feeling. It was a battle. Why did she run? And why couldn't he let her go? Find out in this gripping story. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. The rain poured relentlessly against the gleaming glass windows of the Argent, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive wine, seared steak, and the quiet murmur of the elite. Ethan Carter, 34 years old, billionaire, and utterly disinterested, adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit as he leaned back in his chair, tuning out the empty chatter around him. The night had been filled with shallow conversations, forced laughter, and insincere toasts to wealth and power. He had smiled, nodded, played his part, but none of it mattered, none of it mattered, none of it ever did. Outside, the world was different, raw, unfiltered, real. His driver was already pulling up when Ethan stepped out of the restaurant, grateful for the crisp night air that replaced the suffocating luxury inside. He was halfway to his sleek black car when something caught his eye. A figure, small and curled up near the entrance, pressed against the cold stone wall, as if trying to disappear into it. The oversized coat she wore did little to shield her from the downpour, rainwater soaking through the fabric as she clutched it tightly around herself. Ethan's steps slowed. The city was no stranger to homelessness, but this woman, there was something about her that didn't fit. Her clothes, though worn, weren't filthy. Her posture, though defeated, held a trace of poise. And when she lifted her face for just a moment, he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Pride. Desperation. A silent battle between the two. She wasn't someone who had given up. She was someone who had lost everything but refused to break. Ethan frowned, his usual instinct to keep walking faltering. Ignoring the curious glances of passersby, he took a step toward her. "Do you need help?" The woman stiffened. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks from the rain, her body tense as if she expected him to mock her, to dismiss her the way the world already had. "I'm fine," she muttered, pulling her coat tighter. Ethan didn't believe her for a second. She was shivering, her fingers trembling as they clutched the fabric like it was the only thing holding her together. "You don't look fine." His voice was calm but firm. She turned away, her profile sharp under the dim streetlight.
"I mean, you're petty."
Ethan arched a brow. Proud. Proud. Most people in her situation would have jumped at an offer of help, and for reasons he couldn't explain, that frustrated him. "It's not pity," he said simply. "It's an observation and an offer." For the first time, she met his gaze head on. Her eyes flashed with defiance and exhaustion, a mixture of challenge and reluctance. He thought she might actually listen, might accept just this once. But then she turned away, took a shaky step forward, and tried to leave. One step. Then another. Then her legs gave out beneath her. Ethan reacted instantly, lunging forward just in time to catch her before she hit the pavement. She was so light. Too light. Her body trembled violently from exhaustion, the cold having seeped deep into her bones. Her breathing was shallow, her fingers gripping the sleeve of his suit in a desperate reflex. For the first time in a long time, something inside Ethan stirred. Concern. Not the fleeting, detached kind that came from watching a sad documentary or reading about misfortune in the news. Real, genuine concern. "Miss?" He shook her shoulder lightly. She groaned weakly but didn't have the strength to push him away this time. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had a choice. He could leave her there, like everyone else probably had. Or he could do something entirely out of character. Care. His decision was made in an instant. Turning to his driver, he gave a single, unwavering command. "Take us to the nearest hotel, now." The driver hesitated for half a second. This wasn't something his employer ever did, but the look in Ethan's eyes left no room for argument. As the car door swung open, Ethan lifted the woman into his arms and carried her out of the rain, unaware that this moment would change both of their lives forever. The first thing Lena Hayes felt when she woke up was warmth. For weeks, all she had known was the cold, freezing nights on damp concrete, the biting wind slicing through her thin layers, the relentless ache in her bones. But now she was lying on something soft. She blinked against the morning sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, her gaze slowly taking in the elegant chandeliers, the silk sheets, the sheer extravagance of the room. Her breath hitched. Where am I? Panic surged through her as she sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. The sound of a door opening made her snap her head toward it. Ethan Carter stood in the doorway, composed as ever, a tray of breakfast in his hands. "Good morning," he said smoothly. "Sleep well?" Lena's body tensed. Her memories of last night crashed back. The rain, the fall, the moment he had caught her before everything went dark. She was in his hotel suite, and she needed to leave now. "Why am I here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than intended. Ethan set the tray down on the bedside table, unfazed. "You passed out in the rain," he said simply. "I wasn't about to leave you there." Lena glanced at the steaming coffee, the fresh croissants, the eggs cooked to perfection. Everything about this man screamed wealth, privilege, power, and that made her wary. "I don't need charity," she said, pushing the blanket aside. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I didn't say you did." She swung her legs over the side of the bed and realized she was still wearing her old clothes, just clean, neatly folded. He hadn't taken advantage of her, hadn't stripped her of dignity. But she refused to let her guard down. She turned to him. "Thank you, but I should go." Ethan leaned against the dresser, arms crossed. "You're free to leave," he said easily. "But before you do, I'd like to know something." Lena hesitated. "What?" His gaze locked onto hers, unreadable. "Who are you?" Her breath caught for a fraction of a second. He hadn't asked where she was from or why she was homeless. He had asked who she was. As if he already knew she wasn't what she seemed. Lena hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket as Ethan's question lingered in the air between them. "Who are you?" For a fleeting second, she thought about lying, about giving him a name, a backstory, something that would make him stop looking at her like he was unraveling a puzzle. But she knew it wouldn't work. There was something sharp in his gaze, something that told her he wouldn't be so easily deceived. She forced a smirk, masking her unease.
I think you already know the answer to that.
Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. "No," he said simply. "I don't." The confidence in his voice sent a chill down her spine, and not because of the cold. He wasn't just asking for the sake of curiosity. He was watching her, calculating, picking up on every nuance of her movements. "You knew the wine I was drinking last night," he continued, voice casual but precise. "Recognized it just by the scent." That's not something most people. His gaze flickered. In your situation, would know. Lena's stomach twisted. She had been careful. For months, she had blended into the shadows, made sure no one looked at her twice. But this man, this stranger, had seen right through her in a matter of hours. She shook her head, forcing a chuckle. I used to work in a restaurant. Ethan didn't blink. You also quoted Shakespeare in your sleep. She stiffened. I talk in my sleep, she said quickly, trying to brush it off. Apparently, Lena clenched her jaw. She had to get out of here. Throwing off the blanket, she stood up too fast, her legs still weak from the night before. A wave of dizziness hit her, but she steadied herself before Ethan could react. I appreciate what you did, she said, moving toward the door, but I don't want to owe anyone anything. Ethan didn't move from where he stood. Lena. She froze. He hadn't asked for her name, but somehow he already knew it. Her fingers curled around the door handle, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. She didn't turn around. Thank you for your kindness, Ethan, she said quietly, but firmly. But this is where it ends. She pulled the door open, stepping out into the hallway, feeling his gaze still on her back. And yet, as she walked away, she knew, deep in her gut, this wasn't over. It never was. Ethan Carter had spent most of his life mastering the art of control. He controlled his company, his investments, his image. Nothing ever slipped through the cracks. But Lena Hayes was a crack in his carefully built world. He should have let her go. Should have forgotten about her the moment she walked out that door. Yet here he was, days later, unable to shake the memory of her face, the guarded look in her eyes, the way she carried herself like someone who had known more than just hardship. She wasn't just another homeless girl trying to survive. She was running from something. And for reasons he couldn't understand, he needed to know what. His search started subtly. He took the same route home every night, scanning the streets without really admitting to himself what he was doing. He made a few inquiries with the hotel staff, then a few discreet calls to contacts who knew the city's underbelly better than he did. Nothing. It was as if she had vanished. It was infuriating, but Ethan was nothing if not persistent. He found her by accident. Or maybe it was fate. The small cafe was tucked between towering skyscrapers, easy to overlook. He had only stepped inside to escape an unexpected drizzle, shaking water from his coat as he approached the counter. And then he saw her. Lena. She was behind the register, tying an apron around her waist, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun. A faint smudge of flour streaked her cheek. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her. She looked different. Not like the fragile, rain-soaked girl he had carried into his car that night. She looked steady, strong. Even now, in a low-wage job, she carried herself with an air of quiet grace. His heart did something unfamiliar, something uncomfortable. Then, as if sensing him, she turned. Their eyes met. She blinked. You, she whispered. Ethan smirked. Me. A long silence stretched between them. For a moment, he thought she might bolt. He saw it. The flicker of panic in her eyes, the instinct to run. But then, she exhaled, reached for a cup, and began making his coffee. You've been avoiding me, Ethan said, leaning against the counter. Lena didn't look up. I wasn't avoiding you. No, she said flatly. I was moving on. Ethan tilted his head, and yet here I am. She slid the coffee toward him. Your total is $3. Ethan pulled out a crisp $100 bill and placed it on the counter. Lena gave him a deadpan stare. Very funny. He chuckled, taking the cup. Keep the change. She rolled her eyes, but as he turned to leave, he felt her gaze lingering on him. And that was enough. For now, Ethan started coming back. Every morning. At first, Lena pretended not to care. She took his orders, handed him coffee, and barely made eye contact. But Ethan was nothing if not persistent. He made small talk. He joked. He asked about her day in a way that felt genuine. Slowly, she softened. One afternoon, as she handed him his usual black coffee, she sighed. "Why do you keep coming here?" Ethan smirked. "Best coffee in town." She gave him a look. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping just enough to make her chest tighten. "And because I like talking to you..." For the first time, Lena didn't have a quick comeback. She just looked at him, something unspoken passing between them. Something she wasn't sure she was ready for. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to run, and that terrified her more than anything. Ethan Carter had never been the type to chase after anything that didn't come with a calculated return on investment. His entire life had been structured, disciplined, a precise game of numbers, and power where emotions were nothing more than distractions. And yet, here he was, walking into a tiny cafe every morning for a cup of coffee he didn't even particularly like. The truth was, the coffee was secondary. It was her. Lena Hayes. She still kept him at arm's length, though the sharp edges of her resistance had softened, just slightly. Their conversations were longer now, though always dancing on the edge of something unspoken. She let him sit at the counter while she worked, let him ask questions that she answered in half, truths. She was careful, always careful. But Ethan had built an empire on reading between the lines. And every time she spoke, she told him just enough to keep him wanting more. One rainy afternoon, he found her outside the cafe, leaning against the brick wall during her break. The hood of her jacket pulled up against the drizzle. Smoking would be a better excuse to stand in the rain, Ethan said, stepping beside her. Lena exhaled a small laugh but didn't look at him. Never picked up the habit. Good. It would be a shame to ruin your lungs after surviving everything else. Her amusement faded. She turned to him, eyes narrowing slightly.
And what exactly do you think I've survived?
Ethan studied her. Something you don't want to talk about. She smirked. You're a very observant man. It's part of the job. Lena rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. And what exactly is your job, Ethan Carter? I'm in acquisitions. She let out a dry chuckle. That's vague. I acquire things, he said smoothly. Companies, land. Lena raised an eyebrow. People's secrets. He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. Her smirk faded, and for the briefest moment, she looked almost sad. Ethan frowned. What? Lena shook her head. It's nothing. Lena. She hesitated, then sighed. Just, knowing things isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's a curse. Ethan didn't respond right away. He could have pushed. He wanted to. But something in the way she said it made him hesitate. Instead, he said, I don't see it that way. No. Knowledge is power, and power gives you choices. Lena let out a soft, humorless laugh. Not always. And for the first time, Ethan wondered if whatever she had run from was bigger than he had assumed. That night, He went home and pulled out his laptop. He hadn't wanted to do this, hadn't wanted to treat her like a business acquisition. But the need to know had become unbearable. So, he typed her name into his private investigator's database and waited. 30 seconds later, his world shifted. Lena Hayes didn't exist. There were no birth records, no social security information, no employment history. But when he ran an image search, a new name popped up. Helena Lawson. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Well, that changed things. The next morning, he didn't go to the cafe. He needed to think, to process, to figure out why the hell knowing she had lied to him only made him more intrigued. And then, before he could fully decide what to do with the information, Lena disappeared. Ethan walked into the cafe 3 days later, expecting to see her rolling her eyes at his usual order. But she wasn't there. A different barista, a girl he barely recognized, stood behind the counter instead. Ethan's stomach twisted. Where's Lena? The girl glanced up, blinking in confusion. Lena? Yes, the woman who works here. The girl frowned. Oh, she quit. Ethan's grip on his coffee tightened. What? Yeah, a couple days ago. The girl shrugged. No notice. Just packed up and left. Ethan's jaw clenched. No. That didn't make sense. She had been fine, comfortable, settling in. Hadn't she? Hadn't she? He forced his voice to stay calm. Did she say where she was going? The girl shook her head. Nope. Just said it was time to move on. Ethan left his untouched coffee on the counter and walked out. The city felt different now. Empty. The same way it had felt the first time she vanished. This time, though, he wasn't going to let her slip through his fingers. A week passed. Then, 2. Ethan checked every shelter, every street corner. Nothing. It was as if she had never existed. Even his private investigator, the same man who had tracked offshore accounts hidden in countries without extradition laws, came up with nothing. I don't get it, the investigator said over the phone. It's like she's a ghost. Ethan's grip tightened around the glass of whiskey in his hand. She's not a ghost. She might as well be. I've looked everywhere, boss. There's no trace of her. Ethan ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline. He should have let this go. Should have walked away. But he couldn't. Because for the first time in years, he had felt something real. And now it was gone. Then, one afternoon, fate intervened. Ethan was flipping through a business magazine, barely paying attention to the headlines, when a photograph caught his eye. A charity gala. A room full of billionaires, politicians, and socialites dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits. And right there, standing among them, was her. His heart stopped. Not Lena Hayes. Not the woman who had handed him coffee every morning with a reluctant smirk. But Helena Lawson. She was dressed in an emerald green gown, her hair swept into an elegant updo, a radiant smile on her lips. She looked like she had always belonged there. Ethan's fingers tightened around the magazine as he read the caption beneath the image. Helena Lawson, daughter of the late business tycoon Richard Lawson, makes a rare appearance at the annual Lawson Foundation Gala. Ethan exhaled sharply, a slow smirk forming. Whoa. That explained a lot. But it also left him with more questions than answers. She had lied to him. She had let him believe she had nothing, when all along she had a life waiting for her in mansions and penthouses. Why? Why had she chosen the streets over a world most people would kill to be a part of? And why, after all this time, did it still matter so damn much? Ethan picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. "Find out everything you can about Helena Lawson," he ordered, "and get me an invitation to the next Lawson Foundation event." If she thought she could just disappear from his life again, she was wrong. Because now he needed answers. And he wouldn't stop until he got them. Ethan Carter wasn't a man who believed in fate. He believed in power, in control, in the ability to shape the world according to his will. And yet, here he was, standing in the grand ballroom of the Lawson Foundation Gala, surrounded by the city's most influential figures, waiting for a woman who had spent months making him believe she was someone else. The air smelled of wealth, aged bourbon, expensive perfume, polished marble. Servers wove through the room with trays of champagne, and laughter rose in elegant waves. It was a world Ethan knew well, a world he had mastered. And yet, for the first time, he felt like an outsider. Then he saw her. Helena Lawson, or as he had known her, Lena Hayes. She stood near a towering marble pillar, engaged in quiet conversation with a senator's wife, her posture poised, her expression composed. She looked breathtakingly effortless, wrapped in a sapphire blue gown that hugged her form with quiet elegance. Her dark hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, her features illuminated under the golden glow of the chandeliers. But it wasn't just her beauty that made Ethan's breath catch. It was the way she carried herself. She wasn't the weary rain, soaked woman he had found on the streets. She wasn't the guarded barista who had rolled her eyes at his persistence. She was someone else entirely. And yet, when her gaze lifted and met his across the room, something shifted. For a moment, time slowed. Her lips parted slightly, her fingers tightening around the delicate champagne flute she held. Shock, regret, and something else, something unreadable, flashed through her eyes. Ethan took a deep breath and started walking. Helena barely had time to react before he was standing in front of her, his piercing gaze locked onto hers. "So," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "you're not just a homeless girl after all." She inhaled sharply. There was nowhere to run this time. "Ethan," she murmured, as if tasting his name, trying to figure out how to play this. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "That's all you have to say." Helena exhaled slowly, setting down her champagne flute. "I suppose you want an explanation." "That would be a good place to start," he said evenly. She glanced around, tension tightening her shoulders. "Not here." Ethan tilted his head. Her jaw clenched. "It's not that simple." Ethan's gaze darkened. "It never is it?" Helena sighed, then gestured toward the balcony. "Fine. Let's talk." He followed her through the grand double doors, stepping out into the cool night air. The sounds of the party faded behind them, leaving only the distant hum of the city below. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Ethan broke the silence. You lied to me." Helena turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I never lied." He let out a sharp laugh. "Really? Because I remember you telling me you had nothing, that you didn't want my charity. But the whole time, you had a life waiting for you in a goddamn mansion." She swallowed hard, looking away. "It wasn't my life anymore, Ethan." He frowned, studying her.
What does that mean?
She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. Then, finally, she exhaled. "I left," she said quietly. "I walked away from all of it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Why?" Helena looked out over the city, her arms wrapping around herself. Because I didn't belong here. Because I didn't want to be trapped in a world that felt... Something in her voice, something raw, real, made Ethan pause. She wasn't just saying this to manipulate him. She meant it. "You ran," he said finally. She turned to him, her eyes flashing. "I chose to leave."
There's a difference.
Ethan studied her, searching her face for the truth she had been hiding all this time. "You had everything," he said, shaking his head. "Money, power, a name that could open any door in this city. And you gave it all up to live on the streets?" Helena's lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't want a life where everything was handed to me but meant nothing. I wanted to know who I was beyond the wealth, beyond the expectations. I wanted to live, even if that meant struggling." Ethan was silent, because now it all made sense. Why she had always carried herself differently. Why she had spoken like someone who had once known privilege. Why she had fought so hard to stand on her own. She wasn't just some girl who had lost everything. She had given it up on purpose. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Damn it, Helena." She let out a weak laugh. "That's the first time you've called me that." Ethan shook his head. "You think this is funny?" "No," she admitted softly, "but I don't know what else to say." He stepped closer, his voice lower now. "You could have told me." Helena's breath caught. "Would you have understood?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "I don't know." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city stretched out before them, glittering and endless, but all Ethan could see was her. The woman who had turned his world upside down. And suddenly, none of it, the money, the secrets, the lies, mattered. Because she mattered. Helena swallowed hard. "Ethan, I never meant to hurt you." He let out a breath. "You didn't." She blinked. "You just confused the hell out of me." A small, sad smile tugged at her lips.
I was confused. Oh.
Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached out, brushing his thumb along her cheek. A gentle, lingering touch that sent a shiver down her spine. Her heart pounded. "Do you still think I don't belong with you?" he asked softly. Helena let out a shaky laugh, her eyes glistening with something she wasn't ready to name. "No, Ethan." She placed her hand over his, pressing it against her cheek. "You're the only thing in my life that's ever felt like it truly belongs." For the first time, she allowed herself to believe. And for the first time, Ethan Carter allowed himself to fall. Ethan Carter had always been good at walking away. It was a skill honed over years of ruthless business deals, of knowing when to cut losses, when to move on, when to let go. But this time, he couldn't. Not when it came to her. Even after that night on the balcony, after her confession, after the way she had looked at him, like he was something more than just another man in a tailored suit. He still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. And Ethan Carter didn't like unfinished business. So, he did what he did best. He dug deeper. Helena Lawson wasn't just some rebellious heiress who had walked away from a life of privilege. No, there was something else, something hidden beneath the polished image of the perfect billionaire's daughter. And when Ethan wanted the truth, he always found it. What he discovered changed everything. Her father, Richard Lawson, had been one of the most powerful men in the city, ruthless, controlling, a man who built an empire not just on wealth, but on fear. His influence had stretched far beyond the boardroom, and so had his ability to orchestrate people's lives, including Helena's. And then the final piece fell into place. The arranged marriage. Ethan read the report twice, his jaw clenching. A contracted engagement between Helena Lawson and Daniel Crane, the son of one of Richard Lawson's most powerful business allies. A deal disguised as a marriage. A merger sealed with vows. And when Richard Lawson died, Helena was expected to honor that agreement. Only she didn't. Instead, she vanished. Ethan exhaled slowly, closing the file in his hands. It wasn't just about freedom. It wasn't just about escaping wealth. She had been running for her life. A slow, simmering anger burned beneath his skin. Not at her, but at the world she had been forced to escape. At the people who had seen her as nothing more than a bargaining chip. Ethan had spent years playing in the same circles as men like Daniel Crane. He knew the type, entitled dangerous, a man who would take what he wanted because he believed it belonged to him. And Ethan Carter didn't like men like that. Especially not when Helena was the one they thought they could control. That night, as Ethan sat in his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline, he made a decision. He had spent weeks trying to understand why he couldn't let her go. Why, despite everything, she was still in his head. And now he knew. Because it had never been about the lies. Never about the deception. It was about her. The woman who had challenged him, who had made him feel something real, who had chosen to walk away from a world that had tried to own her. And Ethan Carter was done watching from the sidelines. It was time to bring the fight to her enemies. And if Daniel Crane thought Helena Lawson still belonged to him, then he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The Lawson Foundation's annual charity gala was a spectacle of power and prestige, a gathering of the city's wealthiest elite under a canopy of crystal chandeliers and whispered deals. Ethan Carter had attended countless events like this before, each one as predictable as the last. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't here for business. He was here for her. Helena Lawson moved through the room like she belonged, her sapphire gown flowing with every graceful step, her expression effortlessly composed. But Ethan had seen behind the mask. He had seen her drenched in rain, her hands trembling around a paper coffee cup, her defenses held up like a shield. And he had seen her the moment their eyes met across the ballroom. She had frozen just for a second, just long enough for Ethan to catch the flicker of panic before she smoothed her features into the perfect practiced mask of indifference. But it was too late. He had already seen truth. Helena turned toward the nearest exit, her pace measured, controlled. But he knew she was running. Not this time. Ethan followed, weaving through the sea of glittering gowns and tuxedos with the ease of a man who had spent his life in these rooms, but had never belonged to them. By the time he reached her, she had stepped out onto the private terrace, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the balcony railing. The sound of the party dulled behind them, leaving only the hum of distant traffic and the tension crackling in the air. She didn't turn around. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. Ethan leaned against the railing beside her, watching her profile as the wind caught the loose strands of her hair. "Do what?" "Whatever it is you think you're doing." He exhaled a quiet laugh. "You'll have to be more specific." "I've been doing a lot of things lately." Helena's lips pressed into a thin line. "Following me, showing up here. Acting like you." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "You should walk away, Ethan." His jaw tightened. "Why? Because that's what you do." Her breath hitched. Ethan turned to face her fully. "You disappeared. Twice. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing." His voice was calm, But beneath it was something rougher, something edged with frustration. And now I find out that the whole time, you were— He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. You're Helena Lawson. She looked down, her fingers gripping the railing. You let me believe you had nothing, he continued, voice lower now. That you were just another girl trying to survive. I was, she said, barely above a whisper. Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. No. You weren't just anyone. You were a woman who was supposed to marry Daniel Crane. Her entire body went still. He had struck a nerve. Slowly, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. I had to, he admitted, because you weren't going to tell me the truth. Helena let out a soft, humorless laugh. And now that you know what? You want to fix me? Ethan's gaze darkened. I don't fix people, Helena. But I don't let them fight alone either. She looked away, shaking her head. You don't understand. I do understand, he cut in. Your father arranged a deal. You were supposed to marry Daniel, and when he died, you saw a way out. You ran before Crane could claim what he thought belonged to him. Her eyes flashed. I was never his. Then why are you still afraid? The words hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Helena swallowed hard, gripping the railing like it was the only thing keeping her steady. You don't know what he's capable of. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and controlled. Then tell me. She hesitated. Then, finally, she broke. He doesn't take no for an answer, she admitted. Not in business. Not in life. He thinks in terms of ownership, not relationships. And when I left, I humiliated him. He hasn't forgotten that. Ethan's jaw clenched. He's threatened you. A beat of silence. Then she nodded. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. But deep in his chest, rage simmered. Why didn't you come to me? He asked. Helena let out a quiet, broken laugh. Because you don't get involved in things you can't control, Ethan. That's who you are. He tilted his head. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think. She looked up at him, something fragile flickering in her gaze. And maybe I know you too well. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. So what's your plan? Keep running forever. Let him dictate your life even when you've already left. Her shoulders stiffened. Then, softly, I don't have a choice. Ethan let out a quiet, bitter laugh.
See, that's where you're wrong.
She frowned. He took a step closer, his voice steady, unwavering. You have a choice, Helena. You just don't trust anyone enough to take it. Helena swallowed, her throat tight. She had spent so long standing on her own, believing she had to fight every battle alone. But now, standing in front of Ethan, this man who had seen her at her weakest, who had searched for her when she disappeared, who was still here even after everything. She felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope, hope. Let me help you, Ethan said, softer now. Not because you need saving, but because I don't walk away from the things that matter to me. Her breath caught. His words weren't grand declarations of love. They weren't promises wrapped in fairy tales. They were real. And for the first time in a long time, she wanted to believe in something real. She exhaled shakily. What do you suggest? A slow, knowing smirk tugged at Ethan's lips. Well, he said, tilting his head. For starters, I think it's time someone reminded Daniel Crane that you were never his to claim. The moment Helena agreed to let Ethan help, everything changed. For months, she had been living in survival mode, always looking over her shoulder, always preparing for the moment Daniel Crane would make his move. Because he would. Men like Daniel didn't forget slights. They didn't forgive betrayal. And Helena, leaving him at the altar, walking away from everything her father had promised, had been the ultimate betrayal. But she wasn't alone anymore. Ethan moved quickly, efficiently, like a man who had never lost a battle in his life. Within 24 hours, he had lawyers on standby, security monitoring her movements, and a strategy in place. "You don't fight men like Daniel Crane with fear," Ethan told her. "You fight them with power." And Ethan Carter had more than enough power to end this. The first strike came faster than Helena expected. She was sitting in Ethan's office, going over paperwork that would legally sever any lingering ties she had to her father's empire, when Ethan's phone buzzed. He picked it up, his expression unreadable as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Then his eyes darkened. "Well," he said, setting his phone down, "that didn't take long." Helena's stomach twisted. "What happened?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "Daniel just made a very public offer to buy out one of my companies." Her heart pounded. "He's coming after you." Ethan smirked. "Let him?" That was the difference between Ethan Carter and men like Daniel Crane. Daniel took. Ethan controlled. By the time Daniel realized the company he was trying to acquire had already been stripped of its most valuable assets, relocated, protected, or sold to Ethan's own subsidiaries. It was too late. "You set him up," Helena realized, staring at Ethan. He didn't look the least bit remorseful. "I prefer the term strategic positioning." Helena exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You're dangerous." Ethan met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Only when it comes to protecting what's mine." The words sent a shiver through her. Not because she was afraid of Ethan, but because, for the first time, she wasn't afraid at all. Daniel Crane didn't take the loss lightly. Days later, a package arrived at Ethan's penthouse. No return address, no note. Just a single object resting inside the velvet-lined box. A diamond engagement ring. Helena's ring. The one she had left behind when she walked away from Daniel. Her breath hitched as she stared at it, the message clear. He hadn't forgotten. Ethan watched her carefully. "Are you scared?" Helena closed the box, setting it down on the table. Then she met Ethan's gaze, fire in her eyes. "No," she said. "I'm angry." That was when Ethan knew. She wasn't running anymore.
She was ready to fight.
And that was exactly what they did. Together. Over the next week, Ethan systematically dismantled every advantage Daniel had left. Connections were cut. Deals were sabotaged. Alliances were turned. The board members who once supported him suddenly weren't taking his calls. Helena, meanwhile, reclaimed her own name. For the first time in years, she stepped back into the spotlight. Not as Richard Lawson's daughter, not as a runaway bride, but as a force of her own making. She attended high-profile events, took interviews, made it clear to the world that she was untouchable. And then, finally, Daniel snapped. It happened at a charity fundraiser, a perfectly public setting where he knew she couldn't make a scene without drawing attention. Helena felt him before she saw him. A presence at her back, a shadow where none should be. Helena. Her entire body went rigid. Slowly, she turned. Daniel Crane stood before her, looking every bit the powerful man the world believed him to be. Handsome, refined, dangerous. And yet, for the first time, she didn't feel small in his presence. She felt stronger. "You've been busy," he said, his voice smooth, deceptively calm. Helena arched a brow.
So have you. Though I hear your latest acquisitions haven't been going well.
A flicker of something dark flashed in his eyes. His smile didn't reach them. You always did have a sharp tongue. And you always did hate when I used it. Daniel's jaw tightened. I gave you everything. Helena tilted her head. You gave me a cage. His expression darkened. You belong with me. The words should have made her shudder. Should have made her remember the years of control, the way he had tried to mold her into something she wasn't. Instead, she smiled. Funny, she said. Ethan said the exact opposite. Daniel's entire body tensed. She didn't need to turn to know Ethan was there. She felt him. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, lethal. The difference, Ethan said, stepping beside her, is that I don't believe in ownership. But I do believe in consequences. Daniel's gaze flicked between them, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he smirked. This isn't over, he said. Helena met his stare, unflinching. Yes, she said softly, it is. And this time, when she turned and walked away, she didn't look back. Because she didn't need to. Ethan Carter had built his empire on precision, on calculated risks, strategic moves, and the absolute certainty that he controlled every outcome. But Helena Lawson had been the one variable he could never predict. And now, as she stood in front of him, the echoes of her final confrontation with Daniel Crane, still lingering in the air, Ethan realized something he had been fighting since the moment he met her. She wasn't just another battle to win. She was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. They left the fundraiser together, stepping out into the cool night, the city stretching endlessly before them. Helena exhaled a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. It's over, she murmured, almost as if she was testing the words, seeing how they felt on her tongue. Ethan studied her carefully. It will be. Once he realizes he's already lost. She turned to him then, searching his face. And what about you? He frowned slightly. What about me? She hesitated. Why did you do all of this? Why did you fight for me? Ethan's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man who spoke in grand confessions. He wasn't the kind who fell. But when it came to her, he already had. You asked me once if I belonged with you, he said quietly. And I told you I didn't know. Helena held her breath. Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady, unshakable. But I do, he said, and I'm not walking away.
Something inside her cracked wide open.
For so long, she had fought to stand on her own, to prove to the world and to herself that she didn't need anyone. But this wasn't about need. This was about choosing someone anyway. And she chose him. Helena exhaled a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. You are incredibly frustrating, Ethan Carter. A smirk tugged at his lips. And yet, you're still here. She shook her head, smiling. Yeah, she whispered. I am. And for the first time in years, she wasn't running anymore. Months passed, and life didn't slow down for either of them. Helena reclaimed her place in the world, not as her father's daughter, not as the woman Daniel Crane had tried to control, but as herself. She launched her own foundation, turning the wealth she had once resented into something that actually mattered. She built something new, something on her own terms. And Ethan? He had never believed in balance. His life had always been about the next deal, the next acquisition. But Helena had changed that. Because for the first time, he realized that power meant nothing if he didn't have someone to share it with. They didn't fit into a fairy tale. They still argued, still challenged each other, still pushed. But that was what made them real. And Ethan never let go of the things that mattered. So one evening, under a sky full of stars, he decided it was time. Helena had no idea what he had planned. She sat across from him at dinner, laughing at something he had said, her hair glowing in the candlelight, her eyes holding something he never wanted to live without. Ethan barely heard his own words as he stood, as he reached into his pocket, as he dropped to one knee. Helena froze. Her breath hitched. Ethan, Ethan. His fingers tightened around the velvet box as he flipped it open, revealing a ring that was as simple and timeless as she was. "The first time I met you," he said, "you were a mystery I couldn't figure out." A soft laugh escaped her lips, trembling, unsure. "But now I know," he continued, his voice lower now, steadier. "I know who you are. I know what you want. And I know what you want. And I know there is no version of this life where I don't want to spend it with you." Tears welled in her eyes. Ethan smirked slightly. "So what do you say? Want to stop running?" She let out a choked laugh, nodding frantically. "Yes," she whispered. "God, yes." Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, and before he could even stand, she was pulling him into her arms, into her life, into her life, into forever. The day of their wedding was bathed in golden light, the sun stretching across the vast estate, casting everything in a warm glow. But Ethan didn't see any of it, because she was all that mattered. Helena walked toward him, her gown trailing behind her, her expression unreadable. Not because she was afraid, but because this was everything she had never let herself want. Until now. When she reached him, Ethan took her hands in his, fingers brushing over her skin with quiet certainty. The officiant spoke, but Helena barely heard the words, because all she could hear was the way Ethan's breath hitched as he said, "I do." And when it was her turn, she didn't hesitate. "I do." The moment they were pronounced husband and wife, Ethan didn't wait. He pulled her against him, into something that was theirs. And as their guests erupted into cheers, as they laughed into each other's lips, Helena realized something. She had spent her whole life believing that love was a cage. But with Ethan, it had been her freedom all along. The lesson behind the story. At its core, this story is about choice. The choice to walk away from expectations, the choice to fight for freedom, and the choice to trust someone even when it's terrifying. Helena thought strength meant standing alone, but true strength came when she let someone stand beside her. Ethan believed control was power, but real power was found in the moments he chose love over strategy. It teaches us that love isn't about ownership or obligation. It's about choosing each other every single day. It's about facing fears, challenging the past, and embracing a future that you create on your own terms. Sometimes, the most unexpected people enter our lives and change them forever. Not because they complete us, but because they remind us that we were never meant to fight alone. What about you? Have you ever had to fight for something or someone you truly believed in? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful and emotional stories. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.